taking you back to the green room.
Oh, oh, good. That's interesting. That's good
Yeah.
to
So when I say thank you, goodbye, you'll just be cut off rather rudely.
know.
Oh, we're live now. Hello, everyone, and welcome to this latest UK and a Changing Europe lunch hour session on Trump and the consequences for it's a rubbish title, actually, which I fear was my invention. But anyway, we're going to talk about the implications of Trump, particularly for the UK and for Europe. And joining me, we've got a fantastic panel. Evie Elfie from the British Foreign Policy Group. We've got Sophia Beck. And not a competitor of UK and a Changing Europe at all. Leslie, we're going to kick off with you because you're the expert on US foreign policy. And just insofar as you can you explain to us what you think Trump's foreign policy will look like, what his intentions are, what the main strands of it might be? Looking
Yeah,
through
I mean,
the world.
thank you. And thank you for having me, Anand. And I appreciate the opportunity to talk through these things. I know people like to say we don't know, and they also like to say below the headline that we know more about his style and some of his interests than we do about the kind of broader vision that he's transactional, that he wants to put America's interests first in a more transactional way. Obviously, all US presidents do. But I think they're beyond the things that I think we commonly hear say. I would just focus on 2 points, not that they're uncommon, but one is, we saw it in the inauguration. We know it to be the case that he does not like war. And he said, measure us by how many wars we get out of, how many wars we end, and I think it was how many wars we don't start, but it was all about not war. Now, it doesn't, there's less of a, theory of what peace looks like. There's less of a theory of what stability looks like. There's less clarity on deterrence. There's more clarity on what the instruments are that this president is willing to use and not use. So he's clearly willing to use economic statecraft. And at the very top of that are tariffs, and whether, tariffs could be part of a broader integrated strategy to get towards that peace is one question. Obviously, there's a question about sanctions, but the broader, the question of peace and peace deals, and the two big ones on the map, one is obviously the Middle East, which they've already been contributing to the
Mhm.
ceasefire. But I think there are much broader regional ambitions, and I think the Middle East is a big area for this administration. And then obviously finding a way through what I'm sure Sophia will talk about, which is the Russia-Ukraine war. I think that matters a lot. But the broader foreign policy agenda, both on trade, on geopolitics, is to put America's interests first in a way that doesn't waste too much time with the normative and institutional architecture that's been in place for what, 7.5 years, eight decades, 7.5, 8 decades. If it works, if it helps advance America's interests, fine. If those norms, making bids on territory, or not making bids on territory, don't help advance America's interests, then I think that, one looks the other way. But I do think that those sort of moving towards peace, one of the big things that, we just don't know is exactly what he wants with China. I could say a lot more about that, but I think it's
Okay.
something to kind of put on the table for now.
But can I just ask you one question? Incidentally, to those watching, put your questions in Slido, and someone could put a question in Slido quite quickly to reassure me that someone's watching. That would be very kind indeed. So we're not just screaming into the void. But just Leslie, one follow-up. And one of the things that slightly surprised me from the inaugural is, I mean, was the sort of focus on the near abroad, if you like. There was a lot of,
Yeah.
he's been talking a lot about Canada. He's been talking a lot about Mexico. He's been talking surprisingly little about Europe and China. Is that fair?
Yeah, no, absolutely. But look, it's what, day three? So we're
Yeah,
really,
yeah, sure.
but clearly he's going for the homeland, as it were, the homeland security, the making sure the borders are strong, solving the fentanyl crisis, cracking down on immigration. And it's not there yet, but threatening to use tariffs if those two, Mexico and Canada, don't get on board that broader agenda. And the measures look harsh. There's a real inhumane in some circumstances, not really in keeping with the economic growth that has been facilitated by the trade deal that he renegotiated, the USMCA, which has been phenomenally successful just in terms
Hmm.
of intra-regional investment, intra-regional job creation, intra-regional trade and growth. But he doesn't necessarily like some of the things around it. The border is still leaky when it comes to fentanyl. Biden has done much better recently on the illegal flows. But he's not going to, accept the CBP1 app that has been a really intelligent way for managing legal asylum applications across the southern border. So the crackdown is partly explained by some real things, partly clearly playing to the base and partly wanting to appear to be very strong. And then there's a fourth element too, which is that even though the deal's been very good, he wants that manufacturing to come back home. And so the intra-regional trade is good, but he wants the automobile manufacturers to be actually inside the United States, not inside Mexico or Canada. So that, there are details there that are actually, really significant details for two of America's very closest trade partners.
Brilliant, thank you. Sophia, just turning to you quickly, and thank you for joining us at breakfast rather than lunchtime for you. We'll come on to specific issues like Ukraine, but just on a general level, there is this sort of palpable sense of Europe bracing. We heard von der Leyen's comments at Davos, which just seemed to be aimed at Trump, even if she didn't mention him. There's been a lot of sort of worrying ahead. What is Europe expecting, do you think, or do they not know?
Well, thanks for having me, first of all. I think it's very hard to know what's going to come. I agree with Leslie that he's famously hard to pin down ideologically. He has lots of different strands of thinking advising him when it comes to foreign policy. I do think that if I had to put money on it, I think that when it comes to Europe, restrainerism broadly is probably going to be the most dominant. That goes back to this idea of him as the peace president, him as the president who projects strength and through deterrence, through strength, gets to peace and does not get involved in more wars. I think that is probably an ideology that he's going to apply to Europe and to Ukraine. But, I'm glad that you brought up the fact that Europe wasn't in his inaugural speech, which was more a State of the Union speech, really very much focused on what he was going to do. I think one reason that I was more surprised that Europe featured so largely in the campaign. I think that was because he was basically adjudicating Biden's presidency and fighting the ghost of Biden. Even when Kamala Harris was the candidate, he was still fighting Biden, and Europe and NATO and Ukraine was Biden's big legacy. Now he's able to move on from that a little bit. He actually is not particularly interested. He knows that Ukraine is not an easy play, and so he's not going to feature that very heavily in his initial inauguration speech. I also have to say just briefly that here from DC, I want to talk about foreign policy. Foreign policy matters. The things that really worry you after you've listened to that speech are not foreign policy, right? Yeah. The things that really worry you are him on immigration, denouncing birthright citizenship, daring the courts to challenge him, and just a general sense of him pushing through centralization, wanting to undercut what he thinks of as the deep state. And I think insofar as that applies to foreign policy, what we have to expect is that what will happen is exactly what he wants to happen on any given day. So far, we've seen the system falling into line, loyalists falling into line, Congress falling into line, and he wants to undermine civil service. And so they will fall into line, presumably also, which means that actually it's going to be harder to predict because it comes down to his whims and instincts.
Yeah. Now, Evie, we've seen here in the UK, and we've got a special committee being set up apparently to try and anticipate what Trump might do. Is there a sort of brace approach in Whitehall at the moment, do you think?
I think it's exactly that. And I think the last couple of years, there's been that conversation of potential that a Trump would come, and apprehension of saying anything too overt or anything that could get leaked out, that we were preparing and we were worried about a Trump presidency. And now he has been elected, they can more legitimately plan the scenarios that could emerge. And I think we've sort of touched on it. And one of the biggest challenges is that there is so much unknown. And so for the United States key partners, we're all just sort of waiting, seeing what he does, and then responding to that. You can try and think of a big coherent strategy, but it will be blown out the water the moment he comes in and does something that you're not quite predicting. I also think, and on Sophia's point about the domestic situation in the US, I think there'll also be a foreign policy point as well, in how it impacts domestic situations across the world. And so, for example, in the UK, the rise of reform, I think you'll see that, Nigel Farage has kind of leaped onto Trump's success. And long term, we will see that the trends in domestic politics that are being legitimized by Donald Trump in the United States will seep into other domestic politics as well, including in the UK.
So, I mean, and actually, for those who don't know the British Foreign Policy Group, their polling on British foreign policy is absolutely superb. And actually, they're one of the few organizations that do it systematically. But it is the case still, isn't it, that Donald Trump isn't very popular in the UK? So simply, if Nigel Farage thinks that by saying I have the ear of Donald Trump, I'm going to become more popular, that's not necessarily as simple as that, is it?
No, absolutely. Donald Trump is overwhelmingly unpopular, even among a lot of reform voters.
Yeah.
He's most popular in Scotland, which is very interesting, and I think speaks to his sort of links-ish to Scotland. But yeah, he's deeply unpopular across the UK and actually most of Europe as well. There's a broader thing about, okay, well, he is saying about immigration and we don't like immigration. Okay, it's fine to say this, it's fine to have these views, and I think it will just change the narrative across Europe as well slightly.
Okay,
And
so
of course,
people, if you can explain yourselves on Slido, that would be great. Sorry, Sophia.
I was just going to briefly jump in on this, which is to say that he might not be popular, but he also commands now to a huge extent the attention economy in the US and all over Europe through people like Elon Musk. We've seen the Elon Musk interview with Alice Weidel, giving a platform to the AfD in Germany. I think just giving platforms to those ideas might further, cement the links between the ideology here, the MAGA ideology, and the ideology in Europe.
But again, I mean, the same thing to you, Sophia, in a way, then. I mean, is it necessarily the case that having the backing of a Musk or a Trump is going to make you more popular in Germany?
It's going to give you more eyeballs.
Yeah.
And it's going to give you more attention, and it's going to legitimize you to a certain extent in a way that some of these parties and leaders haven't been legitimized before. So I think all of that helps. The substance of the conversation in that sense isn't that important.
Okay, thank you for all the questions coming in. We've got loads of them now. We've got a question from Tim Barrow, and I'm going to assume it's not that Tim Barrow, the sort of national security advisor. That would be very cool, but I don't think it's him. But we'll come on to those in a minute. I want to start because I think it's probably the most pressing issue with Ukraine. So, Leslie, according to your logic of peace, not war, Trump is going to try and stop this war, presumably. I mean, he's obviously missed his initial deadline of 1 day, but his next deadline, I think, was 100 days. And
Yeah.
do you anticipate him trying to do something about that conflict within that time period?
Yeah, I mean, clearly he's wanted this to end. It's been very unclear what his own personal interests are with Putin and therefore Russia, and what his own personal antipathy is towards Ukraine. But that, setting aside that question, there is this broader question of what is he willing to do, and what is this theory of how you get a deal? So first thing I would say is that in negotiating that deal, unlike the Biden administration, it's not going to be, Ukraine has to be, Ukraine has to want it, and it's about Ukraine. It's going to be about America has decided that America wants this, and what do we need to do to try and get it? And if you don't play ball, then we're going to eventually pull the cord. We have heard, and I'm sure Sophia can say a lot more, but we have heard in the short term, this idea that in order to get everybody to the table, Russia and Ukraine, that there would be tougher sanctions on Russia and more aid to Ukraine. But that doesn't really, sit with one of the executive orders, which was shutting down all foreign assistance, including humanitarian assistance that helps with electricity, I guess, in Ukraine. But there is a question of whether there's sort of, military security defense spending in the short term in order to really force Russia to take this conversation more seriously. But we all know, the outstanding issues are very unclear. What would that mean? What would, how would a deal, if it were even achieved, the territorial question is maybe ironically, maybe the easier one. The security assurances for, making sure that it's not just a temporary peace is very unknown. What would the US be willing to commit to that, if anything? And would that just be about Europe? And that's when tariffs and everything else might come into play in a more serious way. Because they're not just about bilateral trade deficits anymore. They're about defense spending and defense commitments. And it's really not clear, what the policy would be with respect to, I think it is clear that NATO would be off the table. It's less clear whether there would be some sort of broader protection for Ukrainian sovereignty and making its own choices about how Western it leans and what that looks like, which is, of course, incredibly important. And it's not, we still haven't heard, I don't think, the details of where they sit on questions of reconstruction, repurposing Russian frozen assets. I mean, that all of those things, I think now is, maybe there will be a sequencing into those debates, but I do anticipate that in the next weeks, this will become more headline. But it's also alongside this very significant, deal or phased deal in the Middle East. And sorry, final point is, what pressure or what negotiation or what strategy is there for trying to peel China's support away from Russia as part of this? And is that again linked to diminishing or decreasing that threat of tariffs against China, or even dialing down export controls and the whole economic security agenda in order to bring China more into play as a partner in getting that kind of deal?
Right, let's come back to China as an issue in its own right. I mean, Evie and Sophia, I mean, there's a couple, I mean, I realize we're piling hypothetical on hypothetical here, so it's a bit of a nightmare, but this is just what we're going to have to do. I mean, firstly, it seems to me when it comes to reconstructing Ukraine, the US is going to expect Europe to carry the lion's share of that burden. But imagine a world where Trump imposes or tries to impose a settlement that Europe doesn't really like. What happens then? Do the Europeans keep trying to fund the Ukrainian war effort? Are they forced to approve of something they don't really like? I mean, what happens? No pressure.
Should I jump in that I think realistically Europe has little choice but to accept whatever the United States ends up with within the realms of it's a reasonably acceptable, if not perfect deal. If he says, give up the whole of Ukraine, then obviously I think it's a different situation. But within the realms of the reasonable, I think Europe probably just has to get on with it, partly because it can't afford the war effort without the United States. It's put in a lot more than many, including in the United States, have realized Europe has led the way. But actually, there's a broader question about, the foreign policy of lots of European nations, how that is dividing, how Trump might look to seize opportunities to work with people like Viktor Orban or Meloni or whoever who perhaps haven't been the most constructive voices in Europe, including on Ukraine, some of them, in the past. And so getting a European consensus to long-term reconstruction of Ukraine will be very difficult. And ultimately, I think we need the United States' buy-in to be able to do that. We will have to lead the way, but we need the United States, I think.
Is there any way, Sophia, that Europe can help Ukraine keep fighting, even if the US says, right, that's it, we're done. You didn't accept a peace deal we thought you should accept?
Well, in the end, it's up to Ukraine whether they keep fighting or not. Nobody can make them. And there is a debate going on in Ukraine as well over what the future of their war effort should be. There's opposition there as well. But look, I mean, this was never, I want to pick up on one point that Leslie made, which was on the territory. This was never just about territory. This was about Ukraine deciding its own future, being free to decide its own future. And here is, I think, where Europe comes in, because if Ukraine wants its own future to be, for instance, in the European Union, then there is something that Europe can do there, right? And there is something that Europe is, at this point, as we all know, not at all united on and determined on, particularly if enlargement to Ukraine would come without US security guarantees. But here really is, I think, where Europe has to take responsibility and become a much more vocal and forward actor. In general, I think just on what will happen in the next few months, he has extended his deadline from 1 day to 100 days. They're now floating 6 months. That makes sense because unlike in the Gaza deal, that deal was already worked out and on the table in detail by the Biden administration. And then Trump can be credited for pushing it over the line through his pressure. But we don't have anything like that when it comes to Ukraine. There is no deal on the table. And he has made very clear that he wants it to be negotiated personally by him with Vladimir Putin. We know his hostility traditionally to Ukraine. We know his affinity toward Putin. And we know his hostility toward more support for foreign nations. And so if we put all these things together, plus the time pressure, plus the general structural pressures that pull the US away from Europe and towards other regions of the world. And I think the path forward is pretty clear. But I mean, you asked in the beginning, is Europe prepared for this? And Europe has been preparing. I don't want to take that away at all. Europe has been thinking about this, but Europe, as we all know, is not a united actor right now. And Europe is distracted, and Europe is looking inward. In France, in Germany, we have elections coming up. It's really not an ideal situation to, jump into the fate here and take over from the US.
I mean, I've been thinking about doing a marathon for years, but never seems to happen. But the serious point here is we've heard it a lot, and particularly, from the first Trump presidency onwards, Europe needs to do more to ensure its own security. We won't be able to depend on the United States forever. And there's been a lot of talk. How much progress has there been? I suppose
The
that's
$1 million question.
Yeah.
So there has absolutely been progress. I don't need to go through all the different programs. We can look at the money. The money has been increasing, but the problem is, what is our baseline scenario that we're preparing for? Are we preparing for a US to completely withdraw from Europe? We're not at all in a position where we can compensate for that. Are we preparing to rebalance the transatlantic relationship in order to keep the US in through promises and pledges to spend not 2%, but 3%? Then maybe, but we're far from a Europe that can autonomously make decisions about its foreign and defense policy, A, without the US, and B, united as a continent or a European Union or a European NATO.
Okay, and Evie, I mean, the question that's coming up a lot, and I think it's the key question from a UK point of view. Starmer made that Mansion House speech in which he was very insistent. There are no choices here for, we can be friends with the UK and friends with the EU and with the US. I mean, he has to say that, but realistically, there is a choice looming, isn't there?
I mean, absolutely. Ukraine being kind of the first example of that, but there are lots of others too. In the last couple of years, we've done that tilt of sorts to the Indo-Pacific, which has kind of fallen off the radar under the new government. But nevertheless, there's a question of how much can we engage with China in the Indo-Pacific, something that Trump will probably want his allies to be helping and supporting with, but can we realistically do that and focus on Ukraine? And then there are other, big issues, climate change probably being number one. He's already put out the Paris Climate Agreement, which many of us were expecting. It's not hugely surprising, but nevertheless, climate is one of the big priorities of this government. It's very hard for them to stand by and defend that. Same with sort of the World Health Organization, anything he might do with the World Trade Organization, all these values that are very fundamental to the UK government. I mean, Starmer's whole thing is international law. He's a big advocate for it. And so it will find itself being pulled ideologically quite far away from where Trump is taking the United States, and then also working out how it positions itself with Europe. There's been a lot of talk of potentially the UK being a bridge between the US and Europe. There are a couple of routes we could do that. I think lots of talk about sort of soft power, royal family, Scotland, etc. But they are, in the grand scheme of things, small fry compared to some fairly big challenges in terms of ideology and values.
But I mean, if you imagine a world where, say, Trump gives the UK some sort of free pass when it comes to tariffs or whatever, but doesn't give that to the EU, isn't there a danger that harms our relationship with the European Union? Because the European Union are going to say, oh, good for you, you've got a deal from the US, we'll just continue as before. They're going to say, hang on a sec, whose side are you on here?
Exactly that. I think we will find ourselves caught in the middle. And I do think that actually in many ways, Trump probably will let the UK off slightly easier than the EU. The flip side will be that, Elon Musk has gone on his very recent rants around grooming gangs, etc. in the UK, and there could be more of those. You never quite know what they're going to latch onto, and therefore the relationship could deteriorate. So we will be caught in the middle, and we will have to do our best to kind of work between them. And actually, one of the big things the UK will need to do is try and minimize any potential tariffs between the United States and the EU and try and get them thinking constructively. Obviously, that's a mammoth task, but I think if we can help that, that's a positive.
And by the way, that's not just true for the UK, right? I mean, the divide and conquer tactic is going to apply to all of Europe, and Trump might play favorites with other countries as well. Think of Italy under Meloni, for instance. And it's going to be a real pressure test whether countries can resist the temptation to get to become the favorite in favor of European unity behind a position that we're not sure exists on many of these questions. So I think, yeah, the UK is going to be under pressure, but so will other countries.
I mean, just on that values point that Evie was making, I was struck yesterday by the tone that Starmer and Yvette Cooper struck when talking about the role of technology companies in spreading disinformation. And, you know, watching them, it didn't strike me that these were people who were keen to sort of accommodate the, you know, Trump's new mates, the tech bros, but actually were standing up to them quite strongly. And, you know, that seems to be one really central aspect of Trump's foreign policy is he doesn't want tech regulation. You know, they're going to wipe those out in the United States. Do you think between, you know, either the UK itself or the UK acting with Europe have the wherewithal to stand up to that? And do you think they will?
It'll be the first big test.
Yeah.
I agree with you. I think we've I liked that language coming from London yesterday. We haven't had many others come out quite as clearly. Brussels has for sure, but I think the pressure from DC and the new tech oligarchy around Donald Trump comes at a time when the EU itself, some member states are skeptical, rethinking some of the EU's own policies on the digital market and on tech taxation. And so I do wonder whether they can withstand that kind of pressure. I also incidentally do think that this is one of the big reasons that the tech bros are reaching out to populist parties in Europe, because they have one common enemy, which is the EU as the regulatory power. And if they can empower these parties, then that might help their business interests.
Evie, do you want to talk about the UK in this? I mean, it's a big one, isn't it?
I'm pretty much echoing a lot of what has just been said, which is that, yeah, this government is quite focused on AI and tech, but in a let's regulate, let's do this in a controlled, constructive, you know, manner that doesn't just let it run away from us, which doesn't align with kind of tech bro Elon Musk types. And yeah, I think we'll find increasingly that's the sort of thing that will get the ire of people like Musk. I would always caution that, you know, people like Musk go in and out of fashion with Trump, and how long he will be around for is another question that we should always kind of keep in the back of our minds. But yeah, I think tech is one of the ones that perhaps we haven't spoken as much about, but that is fundamentally our values are quite different, whereas sort of climate change and things are perhaps more predictable. So there are a lot of areas. I don't think there's very few I could point to close alignment between the UK and the US at the moment.
Yeah, I mean, just on that, it's interesting, isn't it? Because I mean, Rachel Reeves in Davos today is saying that, you know, lighter touch regulation of AI is one of the advantages we have from being outside the European Union, which was the old refrain.
Yeah.
But that becomes a bit messier, doesn't it? If we're both UK and EU facing pressure from technology companies in the US, doesn't that give us an incentive to align a bit more? I mean, that gets a bit messy then, doesn't it?
Yeah, exactly. It finds us being pulled in different directions by tech companies, by the United States, by the EU. And probably there's at some point in the middle what our own values and our own beliefs are on how you regulate and control AI. And I can't say I know the answer, but I know that we're probably stuck somewhere in the middle. And there is a big call across the world for someone and collective group realistically to create some sort of system and structure for AI. We haven't got there yet. And I think there's so much instability and discontent across the kind of global environment. It's going to be very hard to get that consensus. The UK won't be able to do it alone. And so if we could bring in probably the EU, realistically not the United States on this, that would be positive. But actually we'll probably have to look to people like China as well if we want to be doing more in this sphere.
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? Because part of this is just about regulatory heft. where having, no longer being in a continental sized regulatory body actually starts to have implications for us. There's some fantastic. Go on.
It's also just, I mean, there's just such a, there's such a radical difference in technological power and prowess that the problem is, I mean, there's so many layers of it, but one thing is the regulators, right? The governments there's a gap across all of our countries between knowledge in the public sector and knowledge in the technological industry, the companies themselves. And the regulators don't really, they're not kind of far enough ahead to know how to regulate, which is one of the reasons that the question of regulation, at least in the US, is sort of sat primarily with, ironically, those who are, doing the AI and other forms of technology, which is a problem. But the idea that the UK is, going to be able to lead either with Europe or outside of Europe, the real problem, it strikes me, is whether the UK can keep up on the technology front itself, and certainly on AI, which is, as we know, going to affect us across all of our sectors, and is going to lead to a broader, geopolitical, economic problem in terms of just, competing across all of our industries, across healthcare, across pretty much everything we do. And so while the regulatory question is clearly important, there are clearly, very important questions of misinformation, disinformation, democracy, elections, all the rest of it. It is one problem. And, in some ways, the more fundamental problem is if you want to drive regulation, you've got to, at first have the economic and technological power to be a major player. And that's not happening right now.
Yeah, I mean, that does seem to
have
me
more chance than the EU, it would appear.
Yeah, I mean, that strikes me as a real danger at the moment, that you end up dependent on technologies that are controlled by others. And that seems to be a real danger in the AI space. I mean, there's a question. I mean, Sophia mentioned the fact that, Trump has got sort of Congress behind him. There are very, very few institutional checks and balances. But one question is, could one of the checks on his foreign policy be the economics of what he's doing? Because you mentioned the sort of trade with Canada and Mexico, and the fact that, some of the things he's saying would have massively negative economic implications. So too would his immigration policies. If he delivers on his promises, then whole sectors of the UK economy are going to grind to a halt. So ultimately, in that trade-off between sort of economic performance and foreign policy ambitions, do we think the economics might act as a moderating force?
We can certainly hope so. I think that we know from his last term, and people in the UK know from Brexit, for instance, that electoral maps don't always map onto economic interests, and that he actually wasn't punished in this election by the workers who suffered from his tariffs under his last presidency. And there are always things that you can do to distract from economic downturn that you've caused yourself. You can start a huge deportation push, for instance. But of course, there are also powers within his own administration that understand the economics of tariffs, and pushing Europe into the arms of China and getting rid of the workforce of America. So that is, I think, one of the few constraints that we can hope for. And in the end, I mean, again, I come back to, he's not necessarily ideological in this sense. He wants to feel like he gets a deal. And for Trump, that means he wants to feel like he's won. It's not a deal in the sense of both sides get something. He wants to feel like he's won over Europe, he's won over China, and then he might be able to relent a little bit once he can sell that deal to his supporters.
I'll come in on this as well, if that's okay. I mean, I think that the markets will be a very significant check, and I think they possibly, it's unknowable, but I think they possibly already have been. So a lot of people have been saying, why hasn't he already moved on tariffs? Right? We're hearing sort of February 1st on Canada and Mexico. Maybe China's down to an additional 10%, not what he had initially been saying. And some have said he didn't do it on day one because he didn't want to take the stock market hit on his first day in office. We know he has a diverse portfolio of nominees and soon to be cabinet members and others with respect to this economic question, but he has lots of folks in there who are, strongly market oriented in their history, their experience, even if they're ideologically or even if they're loyal to the president. But he, the set of interests, right? The heads of all the major tech firms, the folks from the markets who are in his inner circle, his broader economic agenda of deregulation, and tax cuts, all kind of move in one direction. The tariffs are and the deportations are the sort of outstanding questions. And so it almost leads you to believe that he will, potentially use those tariffs as a threat and levying them just enough not to undo economic success, but enough to make all of America's partners, allies, and adversaries always uncertain about what's coming, enough to have just enough leverage over them. And that, I think, is, the big bet for the tariff policy on immigration. Again, will he, do a few things that look very big on the television and look quite sadly nasty in humanitarian terms, but maybe the deportations won't be at the level. The birthright citizenship that Sophia talked about, 22 courts have already filed against it. It's enshrined in the 14th Amendment. It's going to be very hard to get that through. Obviously, a lot of people are going to be implicated and affected by this in that very messy middle ground where there's a lot of uncertainty. But will he really repeal it? There's a lot of things that I think he's sort of playing on for the base. I think he's going to moderate to the other part of his base, which are, rich, wealthy Americans who care a whole lot about the markets. And I think he does as well.
And presumably there's also a potential of divisions appearing within the Republican camp because, Trump's there for 4 years. It's his second term. There are Republicans who are already thinking about midterms. And you don't want to be going into midterms with a spiraling deficit and high inflation, do you? Which is the danger of his economic. So do you think there might be tensions? I mean, grasping at straws here a little bit, I may be, but it does strike me that the sort of electoral incentives of the Republican Party might be at odds with some of the agenda that Trump's put forward in foreign policy.
Sure. Go ahead, Sophia.
No, I mean, I'm just to repeat what I said. In a rational world, yes, but I don't think that his voters have necessarily been following
No.
Their economic interests as related to his policies in the past. He does something else for them. But I agree with Leslie and with you, Anna, that there are certainly forces in his own party who might push him in the other direction. Though I would also caution, birthright citizenship. I see some parallels here with Roe. Roe in his first presidency was always the thing that, he would pressure, but would never actually happen. And then it happened, right? I mean, there is a lot of centralization that is happening even in the courts and a lot of pressure that he can exert. So just not to be the pessimistic voice here, but it feels quite grim.
I think those divisions, I think those divisions will come into play if things start to go south, especially on the economy. And they're there, but they're below the radar. Trump is extreme, for what, 47% approval, which is, good, for him in particular. And he's having a bit of a honeymoon even with the rest of the world. But if that goes south, and if that plays out, as Sophia said, in particular constituencies, and this is, where the identity and the cultural politics in plays can ameliorate a lot until, it suddenly can't. And that's what we don't know quite where that moment is.
Yeah.
Where it suddenly can't. And I think the economy would have to get, pretty bad, and he'd have to not have a pandemic to blame it on, not have Biden to blame it on. And he doesn't have those things. So, there has to be something. If there's nothing to blame it on and things really begin to tank, then it looks quite different. But right now, the US economy is charging ahead.
And, ironically enough, it looks like Trump will be the person to benefit from the economic impact of Biden's infrastructure projects and things. I mean, these things, there's always a lag, isn't there? So it's very, very hard to trace cause and effect with economic policy.
Although he is halting some of that, right? He's just said no more spending if it hasn't already gone into the projects and the Inflation Reduction Act. It's sort of temporarily halted. But yes, there's already been a lot of spending that he can't, that Trump will claim success for, not Biden.
Yeah. I mean, we should talk about China. I mean, I was slightly surprised by the fact that Rachel Reeves went to China when she did, given that, you knew that something was happening in Washington, and why didn't she just wait and see what that was? But what impact do we think the Trump presidency has not just, and I suppose any of you can answer this first question, which is on US-China relations, because China has been quite absent so far, I think, but also on European relations with China. I mean, some people say this pushes Europe to closer to China, or others people say Europe will have no choice but to sort of mirror the harder line of Washington. I mean, starting with US-China, do we have any sense of where that will go, whether there really is going to be some sort of, I mean, not military confrontation necessarily, but standoff between Washington and Beijing, or do you think that might be moderated?
So in terms of the military confrontation, I think that will be heavily moderated. I don't think that Trump has any interest in conventional war, neither in Europe nor the Indo-Pacific, and I don't think the interests of Taiwan feature particularly large in his foreign policy considerations. His voters don't want to go to war over Taiwan. There were some strands of the Republican Party, obviously, that are much more hawkish on these questions, and they have considerably muted their interventions. Albert Colby, for instance, has become much more muted and has also not been given a high-ranking office in that regard. So I do think that when it comes to military conventional confrontation, I don't expect much. I do think that, again, coming back to this idea of Trump wanting a deal, I do think he can still, I do think he hopes that in a direct conversation with Xi Jinping, that he can get something that he can sell his voters. I do think this is one of the relationships where there will be a strong mediating influence from the tech interests around Trump. Yes, I do think that they have absolutely zero interest in economic escalation with China that would prevent them from benefiting from the expansion of their business and their companies and their investments. So I do expect some moderation there.
Okay.
But, I think he would love to be able to sell a reset with China, just like Biden did early in his administration. We'll see if Xi Jinping plays ball.
Yeah, Leslie?
Yeah, I mean, I would add to that, and I agree with that I don't expect major overt confrontation. I do think that there's a structural underpinning to the relationship that is going to be in the middle, in the midterm, just incredibly difficult to manage. And so they're bound to run into troubles. And the obvious flashpoints beyond Taiwan are North Korea could be something in the region that brings everybody into play and different interests into play. Obviously the South China Seas, but I guess a couple of questions. One is, does Trump try to have some sort of negotiation under the hood with China about its relationship with Russia in order to, solve the Ukraine question? And what is he willing to trade in order to get China on side, peeling off its support to Russia? And that could have a moderating influence on the US-China relationship if it's trading back some of Biden's economic security agenda, which has been tough. And I guess the question on Taiwan, and it gets a little bit to what Sophie was saying about Bridge Colby and others. I see this incoming arrived administration as kind of moving America's Taiwan policy back to being deliberately ambiguous so that it can deter both Taiwan and China, whereas Biden had been much more clear. There's been a move towards strategic clarity on America's defense of Taiwan. And that's partly, because presumably Trump is ambivalent about America's commitments to Taiwan, but also it allows him to negotiate, spend more on your own defense, play ball on, whatever it is he wants from the semiconductor chips. So there are a whole lot of strategic questions there, but I think ultimately, it is a relationship that has structural underpinnings that even Donald Trump can't, negotiate his way out of. So it's going to be complicated.
I would also say it's another one of those ones, not to keep going to the same point, but of being unpredictable. In that I remember about 9 months ago, I was speaking to a former Trump advisor, who told me that Taiwan was the biggest thing, the most important thing, and if the UK and Europe did whatever to support Taiwan, then they'd get reciprocal support when it came to Ukraine. And I think that's quickly shifted and is no longer perhaps seen as quite as important. And I do think the role of tech interests is particularly important in that, most evidently seen, I think, via the kind of decision to temporarily suspend the ban on TikTok, which says enough about, I think, about his kind of broader view on China, which is he is hawkish in that he will say big statements, he'll want to be visibly so, but strategically he's not going to go to war over Taiwan. He's not going to, if it's not in kind of economic interest or the America's interest, he's not going to push too hard. And I think it goes to the broader concept that he always wants to strike a deal, and so if there's an opportunity to do a deal with China that he thinks makes sense and the public crucially will buy, then I think he will do that. That doesn't mean that he won't also still be shouting about China very loudly on his various stages, because that it appeals to the public in the US, but underneath that, I think some of the policies will be less hawkish, and at the very least less strategic and slightly more ad hoc than perhaps they would have been under Biden.
Okay, because I was going to say he has to make. Yeah, go on.
Yeah, I guess my question is just, there's so much wrapped up in Taiwan, as we all know, and one of them is, what do they think? What do they think? Do they have a theory? And I don't know if they do. I mean, I know there are a lot of folks in that administration, but do they have a theory of what Taiwan represents? Is it just China's sovereignty and that's where it stops, Hong Kong and Taiwan, or is it a gateway? And that's always been Bridge Colby's kind of argument, I guess, up until recently, that Taiwan's critical because it's the beginning of China extending its power, not the end. But the other thing I wanted to say is that, does Trump really want to be the president who loses anything? Does he wants to gain Greenland or sort of move the needle in that direction. He wants to maybe gain, the Panama Canal, and who knows about Canada. But is he really willing to be seen as the United States strong president who kind of lost Taiwan and maybe some other things in the Indo-Pacific as a result, who sort of loses the Western hold on Ukraine, who I'm not so sure that that's actually something that he would sit well with either, because remind me, he didn't really lose any. He set the tone for getting out of Afghanistan, but then the nasty, ugly pictures have been pinned on Biden, not on Trump. And so I'm not so sure that, for multiple reasons, personal and strategic, that just giving up Taiwan is where this administration will willingly land.
And then I think the question becomes what China's plan is for Taiwan, and if there is an opportunity for a more, they won't invade Taiwan, but there'll be some broader kind of changes to Taiwan that might kind of sit in the middle where Trump is comfortable and he's not going to intervene. But yeah, I agree, if there's a big intervention in Taiwan from China, then the United States will probably do something, but I don't know necessarily that China will go there yet.
Sophia, I get the impression you want to say something.
No, I agree. I think it's a really interesting point that Leslie brought up, and it's something that we've been talking to Europeans about a lot, that, it might be helpful for you to invoke the specter of Afghanistan when you talk to President Trump about Ukraine, or when you talk to him about Taiwan. And there are certainly big elements in the Republican Party, including his Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, who think that Taiwan is about more than just China. It's about American credibility and power, and it's about Russia, and it's about zones of influence and the link between the two. I agree with Evie that I think the smart thing to do for a Putin and a Xi would be to not create the Afghanistan images and give Trump a way out of this that doesn't necessarily lead to a confrontation that he would have to defend in front of his voters. And I also do think that, again, he cares about American strengths. I don't think he cares about it in the sense of American power all over the world and power projection. And I don't think his voters necessarily do either. I think foreign intervention is not for him a part of American strength. I think it's about, I mean, we talked about Mexico and Panama, we talk about and Canada, we're talking about the North American continent and parts of South America. And that I think is where he limits his ambition in terms of territoriality for now. So I think it would really, it's not in his nature to want to go to war over these places.
I mean, I want to come back to what this means for relations with China for the UK and Europe, but because you mentioned him, I just want to ask how influential do you think Rubio is going to be in this administration? You know, how much say will he have over what the policy is, or is it going to be run from the Oval Office?
So if I had to guess, not particularly influential. I think he's you can see that Trump, with his cabinet appointments, is pursuing a sort of strategy of fiefdoms, you know, and he has done that in his first term as well. He quite likes people disagreeing with each other because he likes the drama, but also because it gives the final say and the final power to him. I think that we've seen in his appointments that who he really cares about, which departments and cabinet posts he really cares about. That's where he put his closest loyalists, and that's where he put the most political capital behind defending these appointments. So a Tulsi Gabbard, a Hegseth, right? The internal intelligence, external intelligence. What he doesn't care as much about, I think, is the State Department. And I think that's why a Marco Rubio, who doesn't necessarily align with Trump's foreign policy vision, has been put in that position. But I mean, I guess we'll see. Traditionally, these people don't last very long in these posts. So.
Okay. Now, I mean, what does this mean for the UK and the EU when it comes to our relationships with China? Do we have to reconsider? Do we have to recalibrate? I mean, you know, as you said, Evie, whatever the reality, Trump's going to keep quite a hectoring tone because that goes down well at home. And you sort of think part of that tone will be directed at allies who don't seem to be playing ball. Does that make a difference to UK policy? Because we seem to be moving closer to China at the moment.
Well, exactly. And I similarly was quite surprised by Reeve's decision to visit China just before all of this was happening. I thought that was strategically slightly peculiar. And maybe it was intentional in a way of, you know, making our starting point for relations closer, that if Trump tried to push us back, we're kind of closer in the first place. So maybe it was that. That's my kind of generous view of why they were trying to do it.
Very cunning and strategic.
Yeah, exactly. And maybe that's just me being cunning and strategic. But I do think that, as you say, that kind of will still have that like very vocal criticism of China, and it will be directed towards allies. And, you know, there'll be a point about, if you want continued support for Europe, you need to step back on you need to step up your rhetoric on China. You can't be doing deals, etc. So I do think there will be pressure on the UK and Europe to be, you know, stepping back from China, even if the United States isn't necessarily doing that. The question then is not just how much he's saying that vocally, but how much he's doing that behind the scenes. And perhaps that will be slightly more muted. But nevertheless, if he wants a deal and he wants to feel like he's getting a deal, I think Europe and the UK will think that China is one way by which they can appease Trump and bring him on board in European security, which to most of them is the most important thing. But that won't be consistent across Europe. There are, you know, a number of European nations involved in the Belt and Road Initiative, for example, who are very close, really, to China at this point. And it'll be very difficult. I mean, the EU's already struggled with it in getting a coherent China policy. So I think, again, another one where it will be very difficult for both the UK and Europe to navigate that kind of very visceral critique from Trump, but also pragmatically wanting to engage with China a bit.
Sophia, would you agree on the EU there? I mean, is the EU going to have to recalibrate? I mean, so far as it has a policy.
It'll be interesting where the Trump administration puts the pressure. So the Biden administration was really getting very annoyed with the EU over what they saw as complacency over the Russia-China link. And the involvement of China in Ukraine. There was a sense of how can you expect us to keep supporting Ukraine and helping you with European security if you're not more hawkish on China supporting Russia in your own neighborhood? If that is a continued pressure point, I think there's something that Europeans can, there are a few things that Europeans can do there. They have some leeway to offer something. On economic pressure is obviously much, much harder. This is a different America and it's a different Europe than when Trump first became president. And the economic situation, the economic outlook for many European countries is much bleaker and the pressures are much higher. And so China becomes more attractive, or at least seems like there are fewer ways around it. And so I think it'll be very, very hard for the EU to hold the line here. Frankly, I don't think that we have a real EU positioning or policy on China. I think we have a bunch of national positions on China, and even nationally, many countries haven't really integrated China in their security outlook yet. So I think Europe is at the very beginning. We've heard some really strong signaling coming from von der Leyen during the Biden administration. She was closely aligned with the thinking of Sullivan and others, but I think that signaling from Brussels in rhetoric went much further than where individual European member states are.
And in some ways, those problems are particularly acute for Germany, aren't they, when it comes to the economic relationship with China? I mean, do you think the impact of Trump will play into the election, perhaps via a debate about Germany's links with China? Do you think that might happen?
The election campaign really is focused heavily on Germany's economic outlook, and that is obviously closely linked to China. Though I don't think that Trump pressure features very heavily into it right now, partly because none of the leading politicians have a clear answer to how to square that circle, right? But yes, of course, I mean, and there's lots of different proposals. I think the reality is going to have to be Germany and Europe. I think this is true for our whole conversation. It's going to be a little bit of everything. We're moving from a conversation that has been very abstract, thinking about what might Trump mean and what are the different models of responding to him, to now the sort of messy, muddled reality where we're going to see some unity on some fronts and then division on others, and economic hawkishness on the one hand and then dovishness on the other. So I think it's going to be much more muddled than us analysts have sort of drawn it out in recent months in anticipation of this moment.
And we touched on it very briefly before, but I want to just deal with it quickly before we finish, which is, for most European governments, the UK government included, the climate crisis is still one of the sort of policy priorities. And there is a question there about China, which is you need China on board, you need Chinese technology. You've also got to think about climate finance. Where does Europe go in thinking about these questions if the US isn't going to play that game?
I think that's going to be another one which is particularly challenging, not least because you've seen developing countries very strongly pushing in recent, particularly at COPs, particularly on climate finance. And again, the challenge is the European nations have limited budgets. A lot of them had quite a lot of economic difficulty in recent years, and there's not public support for increased investment on foreign policy in the broadest terms, be it security.
And they have to ramp up defense spending.
Exactly. So realistically, I think it means that you just get less done on climate finance, on climate ambitions in the next couple of years, partly because we're so focused on Ukraine and other kind of geopolitical issues. Inevitably, that will draw greater criticism from around the world, from those feeling the sharpest impacts of climate change, and it will have devastating implications long term. I don't think there's a huge way around that. I don't think that many European nations are going to go and fill in that gap, even if they'll talk up the importance of climate, etc. I think ultimately they'll increasingly be critiqued and accused of hypocrisy, kind of understandably, from the rest of the world.
Sophia? I mean,
go on. I agree with that. I was raising my eyebrows in worry, not in disagreement.
Oh, okay. All right. Fair enough. I mean, it does seem to me that the sort of green parties are not doing particularly well at the moment politically as well. So this is part of that broader movement, isn't it? There's a sort of pushback, which we saw with the EPP ahead of the European elections, against some of these sort of climate policies. So I wonder if those commitments in Europe will just weaken anyway.
Yeah. And it is interesting that, I was talking about this with colleague and friend here, Tabavama, yesterday about how the big push, the big pressure points that Trump and his people are putting on the EU is on digital and climate, which were, of course, the two big priorities of von der Leyen's first mandate and the big idea of the green wave. But we're very far away from that, both in our relationship with the US and also internally. I think I agree with you, Anand.
Okay. There's an interesting question here, if anyone has got an answer to it, which is what are the opportunities for the UK in a Trump presidency? Are there any?
I'll say something really quickly and then leave it to Evie and the experts. Clearly the UK is a standout within Europe on intelligence, on defense and security, on, Trump loves the fact that the UK is agile, sovereign, and independent. And so really leveraging that relationship, worrying less, frankly, about the trade deal, which may or may not come, and the optical visits, and really going deep on the intelligence, security, defense spending, and playing a really strong and measured role as that kind of partner. I think there's a lot of, in any kind of administration in the US, there's a basic coherence between the US and the UK position on many of the big foreign policy, national security questions. So I think there's tremendous opportunity if one can kind of, stay at that working level in a serious and pragmatic way.
Interesting. Evie?
Pretty much going to echo what Leslie just said.
Okay.
I think European security is the top one where we've led on Ukraine, we could continue to lead, and I think that's something that would go down very well with Trump.
Okay, so in keeping with my general pessimism, I'm just going to say that I do think that the special relationships are going to shift under this administration, and that there are other countries in Europe that are more closely aligned with where the Trump administration stands on ideology, like Italy, like Hungary, and that the UK might not be able to rely on the tradition of the special relationship quite as much in the future.
All right. Well, we shall definitely be editing that heresy out before this goes on to you.
Fair enough.
We're not having stuff like that at our events. Thank you very much indeed. But we have run out of time. Thank you to the three of you so much for that. That was really interesting. What I'd love to do, if you're open to it, is in a couple of years coming back and seeing where we've got to and what is actually going on. So it'll be less hypothetical upon hypothetical if there's actually some facts to draw on. But that was fascinating. Really, really good. I've got so many questions that we didn't get to. So next time we'll do them. But thanks for your time. Go get some breakfast, Sophia, and hopefully we'll see you at our events again soon. And thank you all for tuning in. And for those who can make it, we've got an event next Tuesday evening when we're launching our new massive Brexit report 5 years after the date of leaving the EU. But for the moment, thank you all very much indeed. See you soon.